You can have a seat. Glad you're here this morning. If you have a Bible, let's turn to the book of Revelation. We're going to be in chapter 17. We're basically picking it up where we left off this past Wednesday night, which, let me say this, I don't normally say this, or I don't say it very often. But this is one of those times when I will. If you weren't here on Wednesday, let me encourage you to go back and check out Wednesday night's study. Only because this morning we're not going to spend a lot of time on the opening verses of this chapter. We spent a long time looking at it on Wednesday. So I think it was insightful, and I just think it's an important part of this particular time period of human history for us to look at Babylon, and that's what we're talking about this morning, Babylon. And chapter 17 presents for us a religious or spiritual Babylon, and then chapter 18, which is where we'll be on Wednesday night, presents for us more of a commercial Babylon. So we're talking about the concept of Babylon this morning. By the way, many people this morning were like, "Hey, you look nice today. I see you dressed up." And it's like, yeah, it's due back at 12:30. But my pastor years ago told me, if you're ever going to teach on something controversial, you want to dress up a little bit. So if you ever see me come in and I'm dressed up a little bit, it's like, oh, okay, something's about to happen. But honestly, this morning we're kind of wrapping up what we looked at on Wednesday. So I'd say Wednesday was really the controversial part. So that's why I encourage you to go back and look at it. But Babylon. Babylon is a concept. There was obviously a very literal place referred to as Babylon in the Old Testament. In fact, the Bible, the Old Testament, mentions the city of Babylon 287 times, more than any other city in the Bible, with the exception, of course, than Jerusalem. John F. Walvoord writes this: prophetically, Babylon sometimes refers to one of several things: a literal city, sometimes a religious system, which is what we're talking about this morning, sometimes a political system, which is kind of what we'll talk about this coming Wednesday, all stemming from the evil character of historic Babylon. For now, Bible commentator David Guzik writes this: it's enough to see Babylon in the book of Revelation as representing mankind in an end times organized rebellion against God. Babel was the place where Nimrod, who in earlier studies of the book of Revelation, we spent a lot of time looking at how Nimrod in the Old Testament is a type of the coming global dictator known as the Antichrist. In fact, Revelation chapter 6, where we first see the Antichrist introduced to us in this particular book, he comes riding on a white horse, he's carrying a bow and arrow. Many scholars believe that it was Nimrod who was the inventor of the bow and arrow, that he used them not only to hunt animals but to hunt people, and that by tyranny he ruled the society in his day. And he also led the people in his day to erect a huge tower. We hear it referred to as the Tower of Babel, but that was where mankind united in defiance against God. And of course, God came down and judged that time and separated the people. They scattered. He confused the languages. But we know more and more, and it has been for several years, decades in fact, that our world is moving more and more towards this idea of unity, of a global village, of the World Wide Web, in communications, everybody being connected. It's once again kind of that idea that we're all going to be united. And of course, the Antichrist will take control of that, Nimrod being a type of him in the Old Testament. Babylon was a literal city along the Euphrates River. Genesis chapter 11 shows that right after the flood, Babylon was the seat of civilization that expressed organized hostility to God. One Bible commentator, Merrill C. Tenney, wrote, "To the Jews, Babylon was the essence of all evil, the embodiment of cruelty, the foe of God's people, and a lasting symbol of sin, carnality, lust, and greed." Babylon is associated as being the birthplace of astrology, the birthplace of organized idolatry, the birthplace of mother goddess worship, which we talked about at length on Wednesday night. We'll touch on it again this morning. Again, Bible commentator David Guzik writes this: in some ways, the city of Rome, which was in John's time, was the clearest fulfillment of the Babylonian attitude. If we had to pick one city today that most exemplifies the world system, perhaps we would say that Los Angeles is the Babylon of today. But the concept of Babylon is far greater than Revelation chapter 17 and 18 and the Antichrist's reign. Babylon was present in John's day, typified by Rome in our day and throughout history as the world system. But under the Antichrist, Babylon, in both its religious and commercial aspects, will have influence over the earth as never before. So, we're talking about this idea of Babylon representing a world system, and the Antichrist as one day taking control of that world system. And again, this morning in chapter 17, focusing specifically on the religious aspect of that. Okay, let's pick it up in verse 1. John says, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls. We've reached the point in the book of Revelation where all of there's 3 series of 7 judgments. There's the seal judgments, there's the trumpet judgments, and the bowl judgments. We've reached the conclusion of all of those judgments being poured out. The seal judgments have all happened, the trumpet judgments have all happened, and the bowl judgments have all been poured out. John says, one of the angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, come, I will show you the judgment, and that's what chapter 17 is talking about, judgment upon who John refers to as the great harlot who sits on many waters. Now, one of the things that I love about the book of Revelation is that it often interprets itself. And so if you look down in verse 15 of this chapter, John is told that the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. Okay, so in verse 1, John sees a great harlot seated upon many waters. Verse 15, John's told, here's what those waters are: peoples, multitudes, tongues, and nations. Okay, so it represents the world. So this woman, this mysterious woman, in Revelation chapter 17, has some kind of global presence or global influence. Now, it's important too, John here does not say, I saw a sign like a woman. He says very specifically, I saw a woman. Now, back in chapter 12, John saw a woman, but he told us that it was a sign. The woman in chapter 12 represented something. No such of that language here this morning in chapter 17. John says, I see a woman. In fact, she's called a woman 3 times. She's referred to as a mother. She's referred to as a queen in chapter 18. She's referred to as a harlot. There is some kind of woman representing or encapsulating this false religious system associated with Babylon in chapter 17. And judgment's about to be poured out on her. Verse 2, John says, I'll continue the phrase starting in verse 1, about halfway through verse 1. Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom, verse 2, the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Remember, it was Karl Marx who said that religion is the opiate of the masses. In some ways, there is truth to the idea that false religion really is kind of an opium. And it's crazy to me to think about, well, it's not really. It's not crazy. It's wild to me to think about. The Bible describes for us in great detail what the climate of the earth will be during the end times or the last days. And here's what we know. It will be one of tremendous deception, tremendous spiritual deception, but it will also be one where organized religion is used to keep people from coming to Christ. Perhaps one of the greatest instruments in the world today that keeps people from coming into a real relationship with God is religion. Because we have been created as worshiping beings. When people reject worshiping God, they end up worshiping something. I mean, even in humanism, you're ultimately worshiping yourself. You're worshiping and serving the creature rather than the Creator, which is what Romans chapter 1 tells us. But if you look around the world, millions, billions of people caught up in the act of worship. Sad thing is, so much of it is false worship. It's idolatry. And that's what is going to be used here. Remember, back in chapter 13, two very key figures are introduced for us who are going to play a major part during this Great Tribulation period. One is the Antichrist, who we've talked about this morning, a coming global political leader. Someone who, John tells us, the entire world is going to worship. The world is going to marvel at this person. He's going to have answers. He's going to have solutions. He's going to seem so wise. He's essentially going to be a false Messiah. When we hear the term Antichrist, we so often think against Christ. Remember, that phrase or prefix anti is closer, meaning in place of. So in place of Christ, that's who the Antichrist will be. It will be someone that the world looks upon the way they should have looked upon Jesus. A false Messiah, a counterfeit Christ. That's the Antichrist. The second figure introduced for us in Revelation chapter 13 is the false prophet, a global religious leader who will work in cahoots with the Antichrist, right? The Antichrist will run the political side of it, but the false prophet will be a religious leader on a global scale who will seduce the world into worshiping this political leader. And at first, they will work very closely together, but as we'll see this morning, there will come a point in time when the political leader will turn on the religious leader because he won't need him anymore. He will have accomplished his means through false worship and reach his end goal, which is for the world to worship him. That's what the Bible teaches us. Okay, so verse 3, John is still seeing this amazing, mysterious woman. And we read, he was carried away in the Spirit into the wilderness. And John says, I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. That's the same beast, by the way, that we see back in Revelation chapter 13. So this woman, again, in some kind of close relationship with the beast, the Antichrist and his kingdom. The woman we read in verse 4, we have a physical description of her, is arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication, and on her head a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman, listen to this vivid description, drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when John says he saw her, he marveled with great amazement. I mean, this is a very vivid description. But here's what John sees, okay? We're told several things. John sees a mysterious woman with global influence associated with worship, arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones, holding a gold cup, pictured as a mother, calling herself a queen in Revelation chapter 18, and connected to ancient Babylon. Okay, now again, I don't necessarily have time to go into all this morning, so I'll just tell you what I think this is, and you can go back and you can listen to the study from Wednesday night. A lot of people, I'll say this, a lot of people over the years have pointed at this and they've said, oh, it's the Catholic Church. I don't necessarily agree with that. Here's what I do agree with, and here's what I do think. I think what you see in Revelation chapter 17 is a picture of what is often referred to as Marian worship. A woman holding a gold cup. We talked about this on Wednesday night. There's an apparition of Mary that appears in Rome known as the Mother of the Eucharist. She refers to herself as the Queen of Heaven. This woman refers to herself as a queen in chapter 18. She's wearing purple and scarlet with gold, pearls, and precious stones. I believe what you have here is you have a picture of the false worship of a woman who's connected with Babylon. And when you go back, and again, we did this on Wednesday night, when you go back and you look at the history of ancient Babylon, And you look at how Nimrod's wife, Semiramis, right, first of all, she was an ex-harlot, but they convinced people she was a virgin, and that she sprang from the sea, and that she became Nimrod's queen. She had a son that the society then was convinced was immaculately conceived. And then when she had her son, people began to worship her son, known as Tammuz. And by the way, in the book of Ezekiel, you can read about people weeping for Tammuz. Okay, but people began to worship her son, but ultimately they began to worship Semiramis. And for the next 42 years, she reigned and eventually installed herself, guess what, as the Queen of Heaven. And you can read in Jeremiah chapter 7 and chapter 44 about people back then burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and baking cakes for the Queen of Heaven, and how the children were gathering firewood and the fathers were kindling fires. It was this whole family celebration where they would worship the Queen of Heaven. 600 years before the birth of Christ. But then through the birth of Christ and the advent of Catholicism, where the church and Christianity under the reign of Emperor Constantine was blended together with paganism, because there was a point in Rome's history when Christianity was made the official religion of Rome. And what Constantine did was he took all these familiar elements of Babylonian pagan worship, he blended it with Christianity, and he thought, well, look, these people are already worshiping a son and a mother. How about we just change that to Jesus and Mary? That's where you get the whole idea of the worship of Mary. And now here we are 2,000 years later, and people worship, by the way, Mary, who her favorite title for herself is the Queen of Heaven, and yet you see it all the way back in the Old Testament. And it comes right out of Babylon. That's why John sees on the forehead of this woman, Babylon the Great, the mother of all harlots and of the abominations of the earth. Now again, that's a brief synopsis of what we talked about on Wednesday night. And you think, that's crazy, right? Where did you get that from? Just do this. Go Google Queen of Heaven, and just go start doing the research. It's not like I'm just pulling that out of midair and going, I know it'll sound good, right? You just start going back and you look at Queen of Heaven and look at all the pictographs and look at all the archaeology in almost every culture. I'm talking about traditional Chinese cultures, Indian cultures, Native American Indian cultures. You're going to find mother goddess worship. And in New Age books today, there's a resurgence of the whole idea of the goddess once again visiting us. Many of these New Age people, not believers, talking about how sometimes she goes by the name of Mary because that's the name to us she's most familiar by. So what do I think is happening here? I believe, again, and it's really important that you hear me say this, I do not believe Revelation chapter 17 portrays for us exclusively a picture of the Roman Catholic Church. I believe what's going to happen is this common thread of mother goddess worship that's embedded into all these different cultures around the world. There's going to be a resurgence of that. And when you really start looking at the apparition of the Virgin Mary's message in all these places that she's appearing around the world, start really examining her message. She's talking about unity. She's talking about peace. She's talking about tolerance. She's talking about inclusion. Does that sound familiar? I mean, that is like the mantra of the day. Tolerance, unity, right? Stop hating me, all that kind of stuff. Well, she's going to bring that message. The Lady of All Nations over in Amsterdam, where every year there's a huge celebration, the Day of Prayer to the Lady of All Nations, where millions of people gather to venerate Mary and listen to what her apparition says. She's talking about one community. One community. New Age authors talk about how when the Mother Goddess comes back, there's going to be a giant leap forward in uniting the world into this one great community. People say, okay, I get how you could talk about how, okay, people with a Christian background, with an understanding of who Mary is, and maybe even some of these other cultures you mentioned, kind of that have a mother goddess idea, Kevin, I'll give you that. That doesn't explain Islam. It's interesting when you start looking at what the Quran has to say about Mary. She's mentioned 34 times in the Quran, more than any other woman in the Quran. She has a chapter named after her in the Quran. Allah sets Mary forth as an example and as a sign to all mankind. One of the most attended apparition sites in Zaytuwan, Egypt, between 1968 and 1973. The apparition of the Virgin Mary appeared every single night to millions of Muslims who were bowing down and chanting for Mary. The Pope, not our current Pope, the Pope right before him, when he was visiting Turkey, visited a Marian shrine, and he had this to say, "This is what unites us. It will be this that brings Islam and Christianity together." So I'm just saying, when you start kind of looking at all the different pieces, you'll find that there, is already a massive ecumenical movement on to bring people together under one banner. Well, I think the uniting factor in all of that will be Mary and the mother goddess. And this is what I think you see in Revelation chapter 17. A woman arrayed in purple and scarlet, holding a golden cup, calling herself a queen, referred to as a mother. I mean, when you start looking at all of it, all of these things are very descriptive of the apparition of the Virgin Mary. I'll say this too, I do find it interesting. In verse 3, where John talks about a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. Now, the beast, again, we know from Revelation chapter 13, the beast there, that's the Antichrist and his kingdom. Sometimes the language of the book of Revelation almost makes the Antichrist himself and his kingdom, it's like the language sometimes seems to swap. But either way, I think you either have the beast himself, the Antichrist, or his kingdom, represented in verse 3 by these 7 heads and 10 horns. But a woman sitting upon a beast. Now, we'll talk in just a few more moments as we go on here, but I believe this woman is very closely associated with the city of Rome. In fact, if you look down in verse... where is it? I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, if you look down in verse 9, check this out. We read, "Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits." Okay, and then down in the last verse of this chapter, we read, "The woman whom you saw is that great city." So this woman is seated upon a great city. The woman is associated with a great city. That great city in verse 9 is represented as having 7 mountains. Another verse of the Bible, or another version of the Bible, I should say, translates verse 9, "The 7 heads represent 7 hills upon which the woman sits." John sees a woman having global influence associated with a great city, and that great city is represented by 7 hills. Historically speaking, there's been only one city that's been known as the city of 7 hills. That city is, of course, the city of Rome. One article writes this: "The 7 hills of Rome are," and it just names them for us, "Aventine Hill, Salian Hill, Capitoline Hill, Esquiline Hill, Palatine Hill, Quirinial Hill, and Viminal Hill." So there again, you just go out sometime, Google the 7 hills of Rome, and you'll just find them listed. The Catholic Encyclopedia says it is within the city of Rome, called the City of 7 Hills, that the entire area of Vatican State proper is now confined. My point is, again, I said this on Wednesday night, I'll stop just this side of saying I'm absolutely certain that the city talked about here is the city of Rome. I cannot stand before you and say, "Thus saith the Lord." So I'll suggest to you that the city talked about in this chapter is ancient Rome. We know that the Antichrist's kingdom will be a revival of the Roman Empire. Go all the way back to Daniel's Well, not Daniel's vision. Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and Daniel interprets it in Daniel chapter 2. Has the 10 toes. We read here about the 10 kings. I go into all that because what is known nowadays as the European Union, which, by the way, people say, I don't think the European Union's the revived Roman Empire. In its inception, the European Union had a very close connection with Rome. The EEC, the European Economic Community, which is what now is the European Union. When it was started in 1957, it was 6 countries that got together and decided to pool all their finances and their coal and their resources, and guess where they met? They met in Rome. Guess what their initial treaty was called? The Treaty of Rome. In fact, guess what the EEC was referred to as in its inception? The Club of Rome. There's a very clear connection between what is nowadays the European Union and a revived Roman Empire. Why do I go into all that? Well, because John here talks about seeing a woman sitting on a beast, and I'll just throw this out there for grins, right? We talked in an earlier study about how the EU, the European Union Parliamentary Building, is based on the construction of the Tower of Babel, right? That's just a known fact. I mean, they'll tell you that. So you've got an artist's depiction of the Tower of Babel over here, and you've got the EU Parliamentary Building. It's based on that. A reconstruction of the Tower of Babel. Well, guess what's out in front of the EU Parliamentary Building? There's a statue of a woman riding a beast. And you see this all over the place in Europe. There's another one here somewhere. Yeah, there you go. You got a woman riding a beast. In fact, on the EU coins, you have an inscription of a woman riding a beast. Now, you know who that is. It's taken right out of European mythology. It's Europa. Just go Google Europa. But this is what you find all throughout Europe. You just have these images of a woman riding a beast. Now, if the Antichrist's kingdom is connected with the revived Roman Empire, and this woman is connected with the city of Rome, and John sees a woman riding a beast, you see what I'm talking about? You start reading this stuff and you're like, really? You're making that up. You're just making that up to make Revelation sound good. No, I'm not. This stuff's all out there. We live in an exciting time. This should not frighten us. What this should do is it should cause us to say, dude, time is short. I need to start telling people about Jesus. Because there's a lot of stuff that this talks about that's happening. Okay? And Jesus is coming back, man. And we just need to be out there busy about the work of our Father's kingdom and just tell people the good news so that before judgment comes down, we can get caught up and miss out on all of this judgment. We get to go to heaven and have a fantastic party with Jesus. Tell my kids I know, man. I tell my kids all the time, like when they're going to bed at night, I'm like, think of your absolute best memory. What's your favorite food or your favorite birthday or your favorite visit to a park, whatever it is. Now, heaven's better than all of that. They're like, oh. Like, yeah, man. The Bible is like the ultimate travel brochure. Steep yourself in this, and I can't wait. I'm excited because like I'm reading ahead of where we are, and I'm reading into the closing chapters, and it's all about heaven. I can't wait to get there. Okay, let's keep going. John says in verse 6, I'll just kind of close out this portion. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, and when I saw her, John says, and no wonder, I marveled with great amazement. But the angel said to me in verse 7, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. Now, I want you to notice something, and it's real subtle, okay? Back up in verse 3, which is where we were just a moment ago, we read about a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. Okay, so when we first see this woman, she's pictured as sitting on a beast. The idea there is that she's dominant, right? She's seated upon the beast. Now when we read about it in verse 7, it's described as the beast carrying her. And that's important because by the end of this chapter, the relationship between the beast, the Antichrist and his kingdom, and this mysterious woman representing an ecumenical religious system that will unite the world, we're going to see how that relationship ultimately changes. Once the Antichrist accomplishes his means of world domination and the world worshiping him as God, he will no longer need this woman. Right? But initially, it's going to appear as though the Antichrist is one of the most devoted members of this one world religious system. But really, he's using it. He's using it to accomplish his means. Okay? So it's just interesting how the language changes. First, she's pictured as sitting on the beast. Now what we read, that the beast is carrying her. Verse 8, the beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, and when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. The language here, we read it twice in this verse, about how the beast was and is not. In the last phrase, we read that he was and is not and yet is. If you go back to chapter 13, one of the reasons that you read there that the world's going to marvel at the beast is we read that he's wounded, he has a deadly wound, and it's healed. It appears as though the Antichrist goes through some kind of counterfeit resurrection. You know, I used the example before when we were teaching through chapter 13 about if you've ever seen, some of the photographs of JFK after JFK was assassinated. And imagine kind of the world's attention on that event. Well, imagine if 3 days later, John F. Kennedy was addressing the nation again. I mean, the world would have looked at that and said, there's something supernatural. There's something godlike about this leader. Well, that's exactly what will happen with the Antichrist. Part of what will cause the world to marvel at this figure known as the Antichrist. And by the way, he's not going to call himself the Antichrist. You know what I mean? Like even in saying this, some people are like, "Why, Kevin? Come on, people aren't going to worship somebody called the Beast or the Antichrist." You're right. He's not. The idea of him being a beast, that's a reference to his ferocious nature. The Bible identifies for you and I as Christians that he's the Antichrist. He's not going to come on the scene calling himself that. It's just, I don't know. Felt like it was important to point that out. Because that could be a common argument. Why would somebody worship somebody called the Antichrist? No, he's going to deceive the world. The world's going to marvel at him. He's going to appear to have died and then come back to life. I do find it interesting as well that we read here in verse 8, the beast who was and is not. Then we read, he will ascend out of the bottomless pit. Now, the bottomless pit, if you remember in some of our previous studies, back at the beginning of chapter 9, we read there about a star fallen from heaven who was given the key to the bottomless pit. And we know from Revelation chapter 12 that there will come a point in time when Satan will get booted out of heaven. He will no longer be allowed into God's presence. By the way, there's an erroneous belief that Satan right now has no access to the throne room of God. That's not true. Satan is the accuser of the brethren, and he's there accusing us before the Lord day and night. The book of Job, we read about how Satan came before the Lord with all the sons of God. And I mean, to me, some of the most frightening chapters of the Bible is the conversation that takes place between God and Satan about Job. Because God's like, hey, have you considered my servant Job? And he's like, yeah, well, you put a hedge of protection around his family. And God's like, okay, I'll remove that. Go at it. And Satan attacks his family and everything, and all of his kids are killed and all this kinds of stuff. And then Satan comes back, and God's like, see, I told you he wouldn't curse me. And Satan's like, yeah, but you put a hedge of protection around him. Let me touch his body, and he'll curse you. God says, okay, go out. You can strike his body, just don't kill him. And so we see from there how Satan goes out and Job breaks out into these horrible boils and sores all over his body. His wife, encouraging word, ladies, comes to him and says, why don't you just curse God and die? Just get it over with. But my point is that there's this conversation. Look, if Satan isn't in the throne room of God, if Satan can't be in the presence of God, how is that conversation possible? How is he the accuser of the brethren night and day? He's there with video footage on you and me, showing it to God, saying, ooh, right there. Did you see that? Look, let me rewind it. He did it again. Look, he said he would never do it again. But watch, he did it again. Let me pause this. Look, that's him right there. Let me zoom in on this. That's Satan. That's not the Holy Spirit. But you know who Jesus is? Our advocate. He's our defense attorney. And he's there going, not guilty. He's one of mine. He's with me. Praise the Lord. That's awesome. Okay. Why did I start talking about that? Okay. So the bottomless pit. Okay. So the idea of Satan being booted out of heaven, look, that will happen. Revelation chapter 12 teaches us that there will come a point in time when this war will break out in heaven, and a day will come when Satan will ultimately be kicked out of heaven and his activities will be restricted here to planet Earth. Now, I think that coincides with Revelation chapter 9 with a star fallen from heaven who's given a key to the bottomless pit. And I think the reference to the bottomless pit coincides here with the Antichrist, the beast who was and is not, shall come out of the bottomless pit. Halfway through the final 7 years of human history, known as the Great Tribulation, this global political leader will go into a rebuilt Jewish temple, and he will there commit what Jesus and Daniel the prophet refer to as the abomination of desolation, and he will declare himself to be God and demand that the world worship him as God, and if anyone does not, they will be killed. And there will come a point in time when this Antichrist, this global political leader, will be bodily possessed by Satan. Because remember what Satan's wanted all along, and that's to be worshiped like God. Remember, there was a point in time when Judas Iscariot, we read how Satan entered him. There was a point in time when Judas Iscariot had Satan living inside of him. Only two people in Scripture are referred to as the son of perdition. One is Judas Iscariot, the other is the Antichrist. Judas is a type of the Antichrist. But the first 3.5 years of this last 7-year period, it's going to seem like good times, right? Flowering economy, world unity, peace, love and happiness. Isn't this great? And oh, isn't the Antichrist amazing? Look at what he's done. And the false prophet being able to call down fire from heaven. But halfway through, maybe it's an assassination attempt. I don't know. Something happens to the Antichrist. He will die, be bodily possessed, come back to life, and that's when everything will turn. And it will seem as though there's just all of a sudden this insane hatred vented against all those who oppose the Antichrist. Why? Because at that point in time, Satan knows he's got a limited time. He literally knows, the Bible tells us, 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years. You can set your clock by it. And this is when the Antichrist will turn upon the woman, this false religious system, and will devour her flesh and burn her in pieces. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what we read later in the chapter. Let's keep reading, okay? Verse 9, we read, "Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits." We already talked about that. "There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition." Some of the more confusing verses of the Bible, I don't know what they mean. Let's just keep going. "The 10 horns which you saw," no, I remember years ago listening to to Chuck Smith. There was like this one passage of the Bible. It's at the end. I can't even grab the scripture reference out of the air, but it's toward the end of one of the parables when Jesus is talking about how the unfaithful servant, how they will turn and they will burn him in pieces and all this kind. He'll be torn in two, and I'm like, what does that mean? And so I went and I got out some Chuck Smith recordings, and I'm listening to, because back then, I was like, what does Chuck Smith say? And so I'm listening to hear what Chuck Smith has to say about those verses, and he gets to that passage, and there's kind of this pregnant pause in his teaching, and he just goes, powerful verses indeed. I don't know what they mean. Let's move on. And I was like, what? I was like, I fast forwarded through tapes. Back in the day, it was tape. I was trying to find what he had to say. And he was like, I don't know. And I got to tell you, so many commentators come to these passages and they go, there's a lot of theories floating around about what these are. I mean, I can tell you what some of the more popular theories are, okay? We read here about how there's 7 kings, right? 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, so that would be 6. The other has not yet come, so that would be 7. And then we read, when he comes, he must continue a short time. And then the beast, referring to the Antichrist, is himself also the 8th, but is of the 7. Yeah, I know. Okay, here's a couple of theories about this. There are 7 kings. At the time John wrote this, there had been 7 Roman emperors. Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, and Domitian. John says 5 have fallen. Of those original 7 emperors, the lives of 5 of them had been cut short. Julius Caesar was assassinated, Tiberius was poisoned, Caligula was stabbed, Claudius was smothered, and Nero committed suicide. John says in verse 10, 1 is, at the time John wrote this, Emperor Domitian sat upon the throne. Now here's where it gets tricky. Verse 11. And when he comes, referring to the Antichrist, we read, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th and is of the 7 and is going to perdition. What some have suggested is that the Antichrist will essentially re-embody kind of the spirit and nature of one of the original 7 Roman emperors. Now, I'm not saying the Bible teaches reincarnation, okay? Very similar, for instance, to when Jesus said of John the Baptist, he is Elijah, if you can accept it. He was talking about how John the Baptist had come in the spirit and power of Elijah, not that John the Baptist was Elijah reincarnated. So what some people have suggested is that, the Antichrist, this coming final world dictator, will be the 8th, but he will be of the 7 in the sense that he will continue the reign of one of them. And I do think it's interesting when you go back and you look at the historical reign of Nero. Nero instigated one of the bloodiest persecutions of Christians throughout all of history. And just to throw this out there, I don't necessarily put total stock in this, but when you add up the Hebrew numerical values of his name, you do come to 666. I don't know. Here's another theory, okay? A second, and probably the second most popular theory of these, is that these 7 kingdoms, or these 7 kings, refer to 7 world empires. Now, we read here how 5 had fallen, and this refers to 5 empires that had fallen before John's day: Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, Medo-Persia, and Greece. John says 1 is, that would refer to the empire of Rome. That was present in John's day. The other has not yet come. This refers to the one coming world empire that the Antichrist will rule over. That's a revival of the Roman Empire, so the 8th is of the 7. It's possible. Don't know for sure. Okay, just thought I'd throw that out there. I will say that those are some of the more trickier verses in the book of Revelation. Okay, let's move on. Verse 12. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings. Remember the 10 toes, again, from Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue. And it's got, once you reach the feet of the statue, you've got iron mixed with clay, and it branches into the 10 toes, and that the great mountain is going to strike the 10 toes and collapse this statue that represents all these empires that have come before the return of Jesus. So we read about 10 horns, which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as of yet. Oh, you know what? I forgot to mention, there is one other theory about the 7 kings. Some have suggested that the 7 kings that we read about there in verse 10, that correlates to the 7 mountains. And some have suggested that, okay, well, the mountains is a reference to earthly kingdoms, and the 7 kings are over those 7 kingdoms or those 7 nations. So some have suggested that the Antichrist, initially the Antichrist's government will be comprised of 7, governments or 7 nations around the world that he kind of ascends to the forefront of. And I do think it's interesting that there are 7 continents. Who knows? Perhaps there's leaders of those continents that he unifies. Just another theory. But verse 12, we read, the 10 horns which you saw, are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. So a short time. These guys are going to be in charge for a short period of time. These are, hang on one second. Getting choked up. These are of one mind, verse 13, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. Again, there's all kinds of ideas floating around out there. For a time, the European Union, people are like, well, the European Union, it's not 10 countries, and if it's not 10 countries, then that doesn't align with this. But for a short period of time, there was what was known as the Western European Union, who were the large decision makers, and that had 10 nations. There's been talk of revamping the structure of the European Union, and rather than having a single president, having 10 presidents who serve at one time. There is supposedly a clause within the European Union Constitution where they can vote emergency power in the time of warfare to a single leader. It's just, again, interesting stuff. But the 10 horns which you saw, there will be some kind of confederation of these 10 kings or 10 kingdoms who will give their power and their authority to the beast. And so the Antichrist will rise up leading over these 10 kings or these 10 kingdoms. These, we read in verse 14, will make war with the Lamb. So the battle of Armageddon. Jesus Christ will gather all the armies of the earth to the valley of Megiddo, right? The valley of Esdraelon, the great winepress of the Lord. They will all gather together. We read about the river Euphrates drying up to make a road for the kings from the east. They'll gather together in this one place. But chapter 19, when Jesus Christ comes back, all of those armies will stop fighting against each other, and they will unite, and they will begin to fight against Jesus himself. And the Lamb, we read in verse 14, will overcome them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. Praise the Lord. That's you and me, right? Yeah. Then he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. We already talked about that. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will, note this, hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. Okay, so at the beginning of the chapter, you have this mysterious woman arrayed in the purple and scarlet, mother, mystery Babylon, the mother of all harlots, and we read about the woman sitting upon the beast. Then we read about the beast carrying the woman. And now by the end of the chapter, we read about how these 10 kings turn upon this woman and begin to devour her flesh and leave her naked and desolate and burn her with fire. I personally believe that when the Antichrist suffers his mortal injury and comes back to life from the dead during that counterfeit resurrection. And the world begins to marvel at him, that coincides with him going into the rebuilt Jewish temple, declaring himself to be God and demanding that the world worship him as God. I think at that point in time, the relationship that he had with this ecumenical one-world religious system, he won't need it anymore. And he will turn, and they will devour and do away with the woman. Now, this is from the book of Isaiah, right? I've made that comment before, and people start looking, right? It's a joke. Isaiah, not Isaiah. This is from the book of Isaiah. I personally believe, and you guys already know this, I personally believe that the Antichrist will be an Islamic leader, and I believe there's a lot woven into Quranic literature and woven into Catholicism that really makes it possible for Islam and Catholicism to blend and unite. And I believe that the Antichrist, a political leader, will be Muslim, and that the false prophet will be some kind of religious leader, almost popish, some kind of papal figure, and they will work together. I think part of the reason that the world will marvel at the Antichrist, I mean, imagine what the message it would send to the world if, in the name of peace and unity, a global Islamic leader said, you know what, I'm going to work in close association with the Pope, and we're going to achieve peace. The world will go, wow, that's awesome. What a great guy. Okay? Now, here's the thing, and I don't, this is why I don't mind talking about this. This is why I don't think what I'm about to say well, I'm sure by somebody it could be construed as hate speech. But what I'm about to say is not something that you won't find. I mean, there is a verbalized agenda within Islam to dominate the world, to take over the world. Okay, you know who one of the richest institutions in the world is, who owns more land around the world and has more resources than anybody is? The Catholic Church. So if I had a plan to dominate the world, I would have no problem going out there and forming a deceptive alliance with a rich organization that would give me resources and power and presence around the world, and then when I didn't need it anymore, just do away with it, because I would have achieved my means. That's what I think is going to happen. And I think that's where you find that this mysterious woman connected with Babylon and associated with worship, that will be at the forefront of this uniting ecumenical religious movement that the Antichrist will appear to be a part of, and he will work closely with the false prophet. That's what it'll look like in the beginning. But when he is finally bodily possessed by Satan and just demands that the world worship him, at that point it's like, we don't need you anymore, and we're going to do away with you. That's what I think you see happening at the end of Revelation chapter 17. That's when I think things will change. Here's what's interesting to me, though. Look at verse 17. Okay, actually, keep your eye there at verse 17. I'm going to read verse 16 to get a running start, but stay with me there at the beginning of verse 17. The 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, and eat her flesh and burn her with fire, because God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be one mind and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. All of this that we're reading about is ultimately God's purpose. And it's ultimately to accomplish God's words. That right there gives me tremendous hope. Because we can read this and we can freak out. And we can think, oh boy, none of this that's going to happen, not only does it not escape God's attention, it's all happening because God has allowed it to accomplish his purpose. And you think, well, that sounds really extreme. I'm sure the people in Jesus' day thought the same thing when Jesus Christ hung on a cross and died. There's not a single one of his followers who, in the wake of his crucifixion, as they were all mourning, there's not a single one of them who was saying, guys, don't worry, it's going to be okay. He's going to come back in 3 days. When Jesus appears to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, right, they're talking about all the stuff that had happened in Jerusalem about Jesus' death, right? And remember what they say to Jesus? They say, we were hoping it was going to be him who would deliver Israel. We thought it was going to be Jesus, but he's dead. Peter and the boys, they go back fishing. Right? I mean, it's like at that point, all hope is lost, right? All their ambitions just dashed. Well, that didn't go the way we thought it was going to go. What are you doing? I'm going back fishing. Cool. I'll go with you. My point is that this seems really extreme, but so does crucifixion. But it was through crucifixion that God accomplished his purposes. It was through crucifixion that God struck the death blow against Satan's plans. The same thing's going to happen here. It's going to seem like all hope is lost, but God's allowing this to accomplish his purpose and to fulfill his words. And remember, this is not the end of the story, right? Just a few short chapters. Jesus Christ, those clouds are going to split, and he's going to come riding back triumphantly on a white horse, and you and I get to come with him. And end it. Oh, it's going to be amazing, okay? So, we'll pick it up here on Wednesday night. I encourage you to come back, and we'll look at commercial Babylon in chapter 18. Why don't we stand? We'll pray together. Father, we love you so much. Thank you for your word. Thank you that it strikes every nerve, Lord. It instills joy. Then there's times when we get tense and scared, but Lord, ultimately we know you're the author and you're the finisher of all of this. Help us to trust you. Help us to believe your word. Help us to have your word written on our hearts so that we might not sin against you. Jesus, as we just pause now and kind of wait in these final moments, help us to not immediately let our minds to just go to the activity of the day. Help us to meditate on your word here in these concluding moments. Let your Spirit just come now and minister to our hearts. Thank you for this church. Thank you for the work you're doing here. May it always give you glory. May you always find pleasure in it, Lord. We love you. Pray these things in Jesus' name.